Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about morphology, the words of language, but we will start with some definitions. Morphology is the study of the rules that govern the internal structure of words, as well as the interrelationship that exists among them. It is the study that discusses how these words are formed, their categories, and how they are related in the speaker's mental lexicon. Now, the basic unit of morphology is the morpheme. And there are two types of morphemes, free morphemes and bound morphemes, which we will discuss in a minute. A single word can have a single sound. For example, A in amoral. It could also have a syllable, such as ish in the word childish, or it can have more than one syllable, such as chocolate. Like syllables and sentences, words also have an internal structure consisting of smaller units organized with respect to each other in a particular way. Now, the most important component of word structure is what we call the morpheme. And the morpheme is the smallest unit of language that carries information about meaning or about function. And what we mean by function here is grammatical function, which we will see in a minute. Therefore, a morpheme is the most elemental unit of grammatical form. In other words, it is the basic element of meaning, a phonological form that is arbitrarily united with a particular meaning, and that cannot be analyzed into simpler elements. So the meaning of a morpheme must be constant. For example, ER means one who does in words such as builder. So you have builder as a word consists of two morphemes, build and ER. And the meaning of ER is one who does. Same thing with singer. It consists of a verb, sing, and ER, which means one who does. So again, singer consists of two morphemes. Sing is one morpheme, and ER is another morpheme. And both have meaning. And those meanings must always have the same. Those words or those morphemes, must always have the same meaning. In such as, for example, ER, as in builder or singer, or sometimes it can also have a comparative meaning, such as nicer. Now, if you look at the slide that we have in front of us, we have words that can contain or consist of one morpheme, two morphemes, three morphemes, or more than three morphemes. So words that have one morpheme, we have and, boy, hunt, and act. So these words cannot be decomposed any further. They cannot be analyzed into smaller or simpler elements. So, for example, and you cannot say is one word and then nd is a separate word. It's just one word that cannot be decomposed any further. Now, that's a one morpheme word, a word that consists of one morpheme. Now, there are words that consist of two morphemes. So you have boy, boys. So S becomes another morpheme, and the reason why we call it a morpheme is because it has meaning, and the meaning that it conveys is the plural. So when you see S attached to a noun, it probably means that it's a plural. So therefore, we have two morphemes here, boy and S. We have the next word, hunt. Hunter, again, two morphemes. Hunt is the verb. If you add ER, as we said earlier, it's one who does. That's the meaning of ER in this context. And if we add S, it means more than one. So therefore, we can have three morphemes, okay? Hunt, ER, and S. And each one of these have a separate meaning. Now, only one of those can stand by itself, and that's the word hunt. Therefore, because hunt can stand by itself, is independent, we call it a free morpheme, as opposed to ER or S, which don't make any sense by themselves. If you put S on a piece of paper and you tell me, what is this word? It doesn't make any sense. Same thing with ER. So therefore, they're called bound morphemes. And again, we will see these more examples in the next slides. Let's look at the word act as a verb or a noun. If you add if, it becomes a two morpheme word, or a word that consists of two morphemes. You have act and if. And then you can add ate. You can have three morphemes, activate. So you have act, first morpheme, free morpheme, and then if and ate. And you can add an extra morpheme, and therefore you have reactivate. So therefore you have react, if, ate. Therefore you have four morphemes. But only one of these is the root, and the root is basically what we call the free morpheme, and that is the word act. Whether it's a verb or a noun, it can stand on its own. The next slide discusses what the difference is between a bound morpheme and a free morpheme. A bound morpheme or free morpheme are typically prefixes, suffixes, or let's just call them affixes that are either attached to the beginning or to the end of a word. So a free morpheme may constitute words by themselves. For example, boy, desire, gentle, and man. And as we said earlier, we have act, we have hunt, and we have and. Those are all free morphemes because they can stand by themselves. Now, bound morphemes, on the other hand, are not able to stand by themselves. They have to be attached to other words. They have to be part of other words. For example, ish. So if you have child, child-ish, ness, li, pre, trans, un. All of these function morphemes have to be attached to another word in order for them to have meaning. Now, in the same way, when we know, in the same way that we have, if you remember when we talked about phonology, phonemes are the basic unit of language, of sound. It's basically an idea. A phoneme is this concept that we have of a sound, and it can be manifested in two different ways at least, and those manifestations or variations are called allophones. In the same way, morphemes can have what we call allomorphs. So allomorphs are conditions in which each variant of the morpheme is known to occur. So in other words, an allomorph is a variation of a morpheme, or it's a manifestation, or it's how an allomorph is one type of how a morpheme can be shown. So if you look at the example that we have here, the plural morpheme S could sound differently depending on the root to which it is affixed. So when we talk about the plural morpheme, it's S. So it's a morpheme. But when you attach it to a word, it can be pronounced differently. And the reason why it is pronounced differently, it's because it depends on the sound to which precedes it. So, and we will see some examples in the next slides. So bound morphemes and free morphemes are basically what we call affixes. And affixes can be a prefix, it can be a suffix, it can be an infix or a circumfix. Now, as far as English is concerned, we don't have to worry about infixes and circumfixes. We only need to worry about a prefix and a suffix. A prefix basically is what you add to the root at the beginning of a root, and a suffix is typically attached to the end of the root. On the other hand, an infix and circumfix don't exist in the English language. So a stem, this is an explanation of a stem. It's a root plus an affix. So a root of a word with an affix constitute a stem. Can we have more affixes added to it to make longer stems? Example, believe. We can have believable. So you have believe and able. So believable is called a stem. Systematic, system, and matic is a stem. On the other hand, the root is the base of the word. It's the free morpheme. So you have paint as an example, and you add er, it changes the meaning, it becomes painter, one who does. The root of the word is the free morpheme paint. Prefix is what precedes other morphemes, for example, on, pre, and by. And suffixes is what comes at the end of the word. Infixes, on the other hand, are typically inserted into other morphemes. They occur in the middle. In English, the only infixes that exist are full word obscenities, such as abso-fucking-lutely. And so you have abso and then lutely, but you have the fucking inserted in the middle for stress and for emphasis, basically. But these are very, they're not very common, and therefore they don't really exist in the English language except in these contexts. Circumfixes are morphemes that can be attached to a base morpheme at the beginning, initially, and finally. And this is something that exists in certain languages such as Arabic. So you have ma and ch. Ma means I don't, and ch, actually ma, it means me, and ch means don't, and then araf in the middle means no. So I don't know. And so in order to express negation, you have to have a prefix and a suffix, and the verb is in the middle, which which is something that doesn't exist in the English language. So we don't have to worry about that. Lexical categories, or in other words, parts of speech. And your textbook lists about 10 types of parts of speech, but most grammar books will list about 8. And so we'll go over them. So you have a noun, a verb, an adjective, an adverb, a pronoun, preposition, conjunction, interjection, and some will add a determiner and an auxiliary verb to this list. But the first 8 are typically what is the most common in traditional grammar as called as parts of speech or lexical categories. Now these lexical categories are divided into 2 parts, what we call content words and function words. Now content words are an open class of words, and they consist of nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Now why do we call them an open class? It's because you can add to this class. You can add new nouns, new verbs, you can add new adjectives, you can add new adverbs. And that's how language keeps changing and developing, because there are new additions to the English language all the time. And in order for a language to remain alive, it has to add to its content words. Therefore, it's called an open class. And you can only add nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Now, when we talk about function verbs, it's a closed class. Therefore, we cannot add any function words to what we already have. So you have conjunctions such as and, but, so. You cannot really, there's only and only but. Obviously, there are synonyms to that. So you can say however instead of but, or you can say in addition instead of and, but you cannot really add new words to denote the same meaning as and therefore it's a closed class. Same thing with articles. We have and the. You cannot add another article. Prepositions, on the table. So something is on the table. You cannot add another word that has the same meaning. Therefore, it's a closed class. So these function words specify the grammatical relations between words in a sentence, but they have almost no semantic content. They don't really have any meaning by themselves. Now, we talked about two types of morphemes. We have free morphemes and bound morphemes. Now, free morphemes are words that can stand on their own, such as boy, that's a free morpheme, or but, it's a free morpheme. But if you have boy and you add an S to it, then it becomes two morphemes. A word that consists of two morphemes. One is free, boy, and one is bound, S. These are called inflections. Those bound morphemes that are typically added to a word are called inflectional morphemes. And English has several inflections, typically about 8. So let's look at some of those, or let's look at all of them. So you have the third person singular S. For example, she waits at home. So the verb wait has two morphemes, a free morpheme, wait, and the S that's added to it, which denotes third person singular. The past ED, she waited. Another inflectional morpheme is the ing, she's waiting. The past participle is typically denoted by en, she has waited. Even though you have ed in waited, it's not really the meaning of a past participle. A past participle is what we call the third form of the verb, because every verb has at least one form. A simple form, so let's say the verb to see, you have the simple form is see, the past is saw, and the past participle is seen. So seen is denoted by en. You explain it by, if I ask you to explain the past participle of see, you tell me it's en. That's what we mean by the past participle. It's the third form of the verb. But the reason why we have she has waited, it's a combination of has and waited, which makes it a past participle. S plural, she ate donuts. So donuts consists of two morphemes. One is free, donut, and the S, meaning plural, is added to that word. So that's an inflectional morpheme. The possessive S, Lisa's hair, that's another inflectional morpheme. The comparative, Lisa has shorter hair, so short or ER. And then the superlative inflectional morpheme EST, Lisa has the shortest hair. Okay, so these are basically the 8 inflectional morphemes that we have in the English language, and we don't really need to worry about the rest. There's nothing else in terms of inflectional morphemes. So when we talk about bound morphemes, let me go back to the previous slide. English morphemes that are inflectional are here. There are 8 of them. And so what they do is basically they have a grammatical function. Okay, they don't really change the meaning. They might change the tense, they might change the number, but they don't necessarily change the meaning or the grammatical category of the word. So if it's waits, she waits, it's a simple present. Even if you add s, it still is the simple present, right? It doesn't really change the meaning that much. So it changes just the grammatical meaning, but not the category. It does not change a verb into a noun or a verb into an adjective. That's changing the grammatical category or the part of speech, which inflectional morphemes don't do. Now, on the other hand, derivational morphemes, that's exactly what they do. When you have these bound morphemes added to a base, and from when you add a derivational morpheme to a root, the word itself changes either its meaning or its grammatical category. And so a new word with a new meaning is derived. For example, you have friendly. If you add un at the beginning, it becomes unfriendly. So here there is a big difference in meaning, obviously, between friendly and unfriendly. So therefore, the prefix un is what we call a derivational morpheme. And the reason why we call it a derivational morpheme is because it changes the meaning when it's tagged to another word. A word is changed from one lexical category to another. A lexical category is basically the same as saying from one meaning changes to another meaning. Okay. Another example is when you have the word modern and you add eyes to it, so it becomes modernized. So in this case, modernize goes from adjective to verb. So modern is an adjective, but when you add eyes, what we derive is a verb, okay, by combining the two morphemes. Now, there are two classes of derivational morphemes. Class 1 affixes often trigger changes in the consonant or vowel segment of the base and may affect the pronunciation and stress placement. This is just additional information. It's not that essential. So when you have Elizabeth and you add Anna, Elizabeth is a noun, Elizabethan. So this is the first class of derivational affixes that trigger a change in consonant or vowel segments. Deduce, deductive, and so there's a complete change in the pronunciation when you add a derivational morpheme or affix to it. So this is one class of words that experience this change in pronunciation. The second class of derivational morphemes or affixes tend to be phonologically neutral in the sense that a suffix may be tacked onto a base without really affecting the pronunciation or stress placement. So we have bake, baker, wish, wishful. There is no change in pronunciation. Anyways, this is not essential to for understanding what derivational morphemes do, but it's just something to keep in mind. Now, if we want to compare derivational morphemes to inflectional morphemes, both inflection and derivation are marked by affixation. What does this mean? That it means that inflectional morphemes and derivational morphemes are both attached to a free morpheme. Okay? Now, there are three criteria to help distinguish between the two types. Category change, change in part of speech. So derivational morphemes change the part of speech. They change the grammatical category. So they might change an adjective a word from an adjective to a noun, as we saw before, modern, modernize. So if you add eyes to modern, it becomes modernize. If you add sometimes ly to a word, let's say careful is an adjective. You add ly, it becomes carefully. So here we have a change from an adjective into an adverb. The second criteria to help distinguish between inflectional and derivational morphemes is how they're ordered. So inflectional morphemes usually follow derivational morphemes, which means that first the derivational morphemes occur in a word or are attached to a word before the inflectional morphemes. The inflectional morphemes are always at the end. So if you look at the word modern again and you add modernizes, so you have here, it's a word that consists of three morphemes: modern, eyes, and as the plural. One is free morpheme. Modern is an adjective. When you add eyes, it becomes modernized, so we derive a verb. But if you add the third person singular s, it becomes modernizes. So eyes is what we call a derivational morpheme because it changes the category of the grammatical category of the word from an adjective into a verb. And the s basically just adds more information. It tells you it's the third person singular. It's just gives you more grammatical information. It doesn't do anything to the word. It doesn't really change the category. Therefore, inflectional morphemes typically occur at the end. The third criteria, or the third criterion, is rule of productivity, which means that inflectional morphology is more productive than derivational morphology. What does this mean? This means that inflectional morphemes apply freely to stems, that you can add s pretty much to any word in the third person singular, and it will always mean a third person singular verb. So if you add s to any verb, it means the same thing. On the other hand, derivational morphemes are not necessarily, they don't go through the same change. So you have able is more productive than un. So you could add the word able, but you cannot to a word to derive a new word. For example, what is I can't think of a word to which you can attach able. I'm pretty sure you can, because now I am thinking too much. Comfort. Let's say comfort, and then you add able, it becomes comfortable. Okay, but you can add un. Well, here's I didn't even see this. Acceptable. So accept, you add acceptable, or you can add unacceptable, and unhappy. But you cannot say unsad. Okay. On the other hand, for inflectional morphemes like s, you can add it to any word and it will always mean the same thing. But some of these derivational morphemes cannot be added all the time to every single word and have the same meaning, and therefore we call them less productive than the inflectional morphology. Here's a little table that gives you more information about the distinction between inflectional and derivational morphemes. So you have inflectional have a grammatical function. The word class doesn't really change when you add an inflection to it or an inflectional morpheme, and they're often required by rules of grammar. So if you have he walks home, walks is always the verb walk always requires s when it's he, the third person singular. So it's a requirement of grammar, of English grammar. And as I said earlier, they always follow derivational morphemes. They're always at the end, and they're productive because you can tack them to any word and they will have the same meaning. On the other hand, derivational morphemes, they have a lexical function. They change in meaning. They change the meaning of the word when they're attached to it. They may cause word or class change. So the word can change from one category to another, from a verb to a noun, from a noun to an adjective, etc. And it causes some meaning change. For example, friendly, you add un, it becomes unfriendly. So there is a change in meaning. Therefore, un is a derivational morpheme. It's not an inflectional morpheme. They're not necessarily required by rules of grammar, like inflections. Obviously, if the inflectional morphemes follow derivational morphemes, this means that derivational morphemes precede inflectional morphemes, and some might be productive, but many are non-productive, as we saw. So the un might work in unhappy, but it may not work with unsad. So you cannot say sad and unsad. So therefore, un is not a productive derivational morpheme. Here's some examples of derivational morphology. So you have, let's go back. I think this is from the text, from your textbook. So you have a noun, and this is basically a diagram or tree diagram. A noun consists of a verb and an affix. So the verb is treat, and ment is the affix. So treatment is the noun. So the noun consists of two morphemes, a free morpheme, treat, and the affix or the bound morpheme is ment. Now the question is, what kind of morpheme is ment? Is it a free morpheme or a bound morpheme? Obviously it's a bound morpheme because it cannot stand by itself. So if it's a bound morpheme, what kind of bound morpheme is it? Is it inflectional or derivational? If it's inflectional, it means it doesn't really change the meaning or the grammatical category. It just adds some grammatical function. If it's derivational, then yes, it changes the meaning or it changes the grammatical category of the word or the lexical category. Of course it does, because treat is a verb. When you add ment to it, it becomes a noun. Therefore, when you derive a noun by adding a suffix or an affix or a bound morpheme, that bound morpheme is called a derivational morpheme. The other one is unkind. Unkind is an adjective that consists of an affix or a derivational morpheme and an adjective, kind. So unkind, obviously when you add un, there's a change in meaning. Therefore, un is a derivational morpheme. So these are two examples that show you how we form derivational morphology by adding derivational morphemes to an existing word. Another example is season, seasonal. So season is a noun. If you add al, it becomes an adjective. Modern, we saw this on modernize. This is very small. You have to really, hang on, let me see if I can make it a little bigger. So this is a morpheme chart, which gives you a pretty decent idea of what we've talked about so far. So a morpheme, as the smallest unit of a word, consists of a free or bound morpheme. It can be either a free morpheme or a bound morpheme. Now, if it's a free morpheme, it can be lexical. For example, child, or the verb teach, or it can be functional. So in this case, it would be and or the. So here, functional means grammatical, okay? Or it can be can have a vocabulary meaning or a lexical category. A child is a noun, and teach is a verb. So morphemes can either be free, they can stand by themselves. All of these words can stand by themselves. They can also be bound. And bound morphemes can either be derivational or inflectional. So a derivational morpheme would be ness. For example, happy, happiness. Okay? Happy is an adjective. When you add ness to it, it becomes a noun. Therefore, ness is a derivational morpheme. Play. So play, if you add it becomes replay. So here there is a change in meaning, and therefore when the morpheme changes the meaning of a word, when it's attached to it, it's called a derivational morpheme. It can also be an inflectional morpheme, and that's when you add the morpheme to the end of the word to give extra information about grammar, such as the third person singular s or the past tense ed. And these are the examples we saw earlier in the previous slides. Now we come to discussing a bit more detail of these bound morphemes, and we will talk about what we call morphophonemic rules, and they're rules that specify the pronunciation of morphemes, bound morphemes in particular. So again, a morpheme is the smallest unit of language, a word or part of a word that carries information about meaning or function. This is just a recap of what we had said earlier. So boys is a word that consists of two morphemes, boy and s. Okay, so a morpheme is the smallest unit of language, but it has meaning, as opposed to a phoneme, which we saw in phonology. It doesn't have meaning. It's just an idea of a sound, but it doesn't have meaning. It's when you put those ideas, those sounds together to form a word, that's when you have meaning, and that's when you have a morpheme. So if you look at boy, it has three sounds, b, o, and y, b, o, and y. So you have three phonemes, but when you put them together, you form a morpheme. Okay, and that morpheme can stand on its own, and that's why it's called a free morpheme. Now if you add s to it, it basically denotes the plural. And so boy has two morphemes, one free morpheme and one bound morpheme. Now that bound morpheme, is it inflectional or derivational? It's inflectional, simply because it only gives you information about the grammar. It doesn't really change the grammatical category, or it does not change the meaning of the word that it's attached to. An allomorph is the different realization of a morpheme. So example, the plural morpheme s can be realized in three different ways. In other words, it has three different pronunciations, or three different allomorphs. It can be pronounced as s, as z, or as is. And this is something that we already saw in phonology, and I had promised at the time that we would be looking at it again in this chapter. So here we have the morpheme s, which basically means the plural. Well, it could mean two things. It could mean the third person singular s, or it could mean the plural s. And it has three different realizations, either s, z, or is. And so this is the breakdown of the phonological environment of the allomorph variant. So pronouncing the s morpheme can be realized in three different ways. After voiceless sounds, except sh and ch and s, the s, the plural s is, or the third person singular s is pronounced as s. Okay, so walks, talks, stops, etc. Now, on the other hand, if it occurs following a voiced sound, with the exception of z, j, and j, then it's pronounced as z. So if we have the word or the verb open and you add s to it, she opens. We don't say she opens, she opens. So the z sound is what you hear. And last but not least is the is pronunciation of the S morpheme, which basically occurs after sibilant sounds. And sibilant sounds are s, z, sh, j, ch, j. So anytime a word ends with one of these 6 sibilant sounds, and then you have S at the end, then you must say is. For example, church, churches. Okay? In British English, it's more of an is, so like churches. But in American English, you only have the schwa, churches. Therefore, the distribution of allomorphs in English is conditioned by the final segment or sound of the singular form. In simpler terms, it's the final sound of a word that determines the pronunciation of the S morpheme as to whether it should be pronounced s or z or is. It's that final sound that determines that pronunciation of the S morpheme. What does this tell us? It tells us that this is not a random process. Pronunciation is not a random process. It is governed by rules, and it follows obligatory phonological processes of voice assimilation. And this is something that we talked about in the chapter on phonology. Now, from the S morpheme, we're going to move on to the past tense morpheme, which is typically referred to as the ED that you attach to a word. Now, again, the ED has 3 phonetic past tense morphemes for regular verbs. This should be allomorphs, not morphemes. I should correct this. So I can't correct it now. But anyways, so the past tense ed is the morpheme itself, but the 3 different realizations of that morpheme is called 3 allomorphs. So you have t, d, and id. So the allomorphs, or the realizations of the morpheme, the past tense morpheme ed, depend again on the last sound to which it is attached. So it's pronounced as t following voiceless segments. So if you have walk, k is voiceless. Therefore, if you add ed to k, it becomes walked. We don't say walked, it's walked. Stop, stopped. On the other hand, if it follows a voiced segment or a voiced sound, it's pronounced as d. For instance, opened. If it follows an alveolar stop, t or d, and these are the only 2, anytime a past tense morpheme follows t or d, it's pronounced id. For example, wanted, wanted, needed, etc. Okay? Now we're going to move on a little bit to the second part of this lecture, which is about how new words are formed in English. And this is something that the textbook discusses as part of morphology. And the new words have something to do with our ability to make distinctions between some possible or impossible combinations of morphemes. For example, when you have the word system, if somebody tells you unsystem, you know that that's not English. However, unsystematic, you know that it is an English word. So you cannot add un to a noun system because it wouldn't make sense in English. But if you add col and un, a prefix and a suffix, it exists. Okay, so what this is further evidence that the morphological component of this mental grammar consists not just of a lexicon. In other words, it doesn't consist just of a list of existing words, but also the rules that we use, that we know unconsciously, that enable us to create and understand new words and to recognize what is a possible word and what is an impossible word. So let's start with some words and how they're created. So you have a lexical gap or an accidental gap. Blick, clam, and antiquify. So basically this means that sometimes well-formed but non-existing words, these are well-formed but words that don't exist in the English language, either of the sound sequence or the combinations of morphemes that remain unused. But who knows, maybe in the future we might have these words enter the English language. But at least as we look at them now, blick doesn't exist because there is nothing that means blick, but who knows, it's possible that it could enter the English language. So these are what we call accidental gaps or lexical gaps. A neologism is basically the creation of new words. And although all languages are equal in terms of complexity and grammar, new words are generally based or generated based on the cultures that are more technologically advanced and complex. So the more a culture is technologically advanced, the more innovations and inventions, and therefore the more there is a need for creating new words. That's what we call neologism. And the example that we have here is to Google. So Google was created in the United States as a result of technological invention and innovation, and therefore we created the word to Google in order to mean something that's connected to American culture. But it was borrowed by other cultures, and now it's used all over the world, even in other languages. Then there's the borrowing, and the borrowing basically is this phenomenon where you have one language borrowing words from other languages and adopting them. And English is known for borrowing so many words, especially from French and from the Romance languages. And most of the borrowed words that have entered the English language, more than 10,000 words actually entered the English language as a result of the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Derivation, and this is basically a process where you have trade, travel, the process of deriving new words through the addition of a derivational affix or a morpheme. It could be a prefix or a suffix. For example, you have detox or so tox comes from tox, and then de is less or to get rid of, and then deplane is to get off the plane. Then we have back formation. Back formation is basically a new word. It means that a new word may enter the language because of an incorrect morphological analysis. For example, the word pedal was derived from peddler on the mistaken assumption that er was the agentive suffix, someone who does something. But language purists sometimes will go crazy. They will rail against these back formations and cite words such as liaise or enthuse, for example, as deriving from the word liaison or enthusiasm as examples of language corruption. But language is not really corrupt. It is adaptable and changeable, and it has to continue to adapt and change if it is to remain current and alive. Once a language stops changing and adapting and borrowing, it dies, basically. That's what happened to Latin. Next one is compound, and the compound is the combination of two roots. So you have veggie and burger. Those are two roots of each separate, and you combine them and you get a new meaning. Next one is blending, and blends are produced by combining two words, but parts of the words that are combined might be deleted. For example, is it a sort of compounding where parts of the word are clipped and then combined, or where the new word is a blend carrying meaning from each part? For example, you have smog. So a smog is a combination of the word smoke and fog. Brunch is a combination of breakfast and lunch. A motel is a combination of a motor hotel and a hotel. A sitcom is a combination of a situation and a comedy. So this is what we mean by blending. The next type of new words and how they are formed consists of reduced words, and this is what happens when text messaging takes over. So you have words used in text messaging, and they're, instead of saying because, they say cause. I'm pretty sure young people can think of so many other words that I can't think of. Clipping, it's basically you take a word and you clip it, and it becomes shorter version of the actual word. So instead of professor, you have prof. Instead of gymnasium, you have gym. And then you have acronyms, and acronyms are sometimes they're called alphabetical abbreviations. So you have UNESCO, which stands for United States Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and you just take the first letter of each of these words and you combine them into a whole, and it becomes a word in itself. The NFL is the National Football League. UNICEF is the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, etc. Eponyms are people's names. For example, words that are taken from people's names or adopted from people's names, such as saxophone, which refers to Adolf Joseph saxophone. The Braille, the writing system, is the result of the name Charles Braille. And then you have trade names. You have words that are invented to label new products. And this is again as a result of technological advances. And so you have Xerox, Kleenex, Ford, and these are the names of trade. They refer to a certain product, but now they have become part of our daily vocabulary that refer to, Kleenex refers to a tissue, for example, that we use. Copy machine is a Xerox, or to Xerox or to copy. Instead of saying to copy, you just say to Xerox. And this is basically what also is referred to as word coinage. So you consider new words that are added to a language by coining new words, typically from trade or from technology. Now, to sum up the conversation or the discussion that we've had today, it's good to know how new words are formed, but the essential part that you need to keep in mind, it's about English morphemes. And this is again, this is a copy from your textbook, so you should have access to it. I don't have the page number, but so English morphemes, as you can see, consist of free morphemes or bound morphemes. Okay, free morphemes can be in open class, content, or lexical words, such as nouns, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs. And they can also be closed class or function words or grammatical words that can be conjunctions, prepositions, articles, pronouns, auxiliaries, etc. Okay? So these are free morphemes. They can stand on their own. There are two types again, content or function. This is easy. The ones that are a bit complicated is the bound morphemes. The bound morphemes are basically two types. We didn't really discuss, we only discussed one type. We discussed affixes. So I would like you to not worry too much about the root here, because this is not something that's discussed in the book and we're not going to get into it. So if you could just focus on the bound morpheme being an affix. Okay, and an affix can be either a prefix or a suffix. And this affix can be either derivational or inflectional. So a derivational morpheme can be a prefix, for example, pre or un or con, and it's attached to the beginning, at the beginning of a word. And it changes the category, the grammatical category, or it changes the meaning of the word that it attached to, and we derive a new word or a new meaning. It could also be a suffix, for example, li or ist or ment. Once you add this to the end of a word, we derive a new meaning or a new grammatical category. So happy, happily. So from adjective you have a noun. Ist, piano, pianist. So piano is a noun, pianist is the one who plays. Meant, I can't think of a word that ends with meant. I can't. But anyways, meant, when you add it to a word, it basically you derive a noun, because meant is typically a noun. I'm trying to think of a word to which you can attach meant. I can't. Sorry. But the inflectional morphemes are basically attached to a word to provide more information about the grammatical meaning. It doesn't really change the word or its category, and they usually occur after the derivational morphemes. Okay, and so this is a neat little summary of the English morphemes, and it provides you with a nice breakdown and the difference between free and bound morphemes, and then within bound morphemes gives you different types of bound morphemes, either derivational or inflectional. Now I have thought of a word to which you can add meant, assess. So the word assess is a verb. If you add meant, it becomes assessment. So from a verb you derive a noun by adding meant. Now I'll be able to sleep tonight. Have a good evening, and I hope this has been useful.